Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you today. So as you just heard, I'm excited to share with you some of the recent developments here at MIT on social and ethical responsibilities of computing, or as we would like to say locally, CERC. Let's see if I can get the next. Yeah, OK. So I'll start with just some brief warm-ups here. I think many of us have examples like these on our minds already about technologies that are broadly called things like artificial intelligence, or maybe more specifically machine learning techniques and so on. Very fancy, very advanced computing techniques that are now moving well beyond academic or laboratory settings, and that has some extraordinary opportunities for societal benefit. It also has some real harms, already happening and potential additional harms and challenges. And that has galvanized a number of us here at MIT, as at many places around the world, to think pretty carefully about how we develop and deploy tools like artificial intelligence, not only in laboratory settings. So that'll be a warm-up, and then I'll use that to talk about just a handful of things that we're doing here at MIT in CERC, the social and ethical responsibilities of computing. And then I'll zoom in on just a few examples for that last part, some new teams and new tools that we're very excited about that we hope will at least be useful on campus and beyond. OK. So again, I hope it's clear for everyone in the room here that there are really just extraordinary opportunities for very significant societal benefit coming from these latest advances in computing. We can call those artificial intelligence as a broad catch-all, but it's really modern computing techniques broadly. Here are some examples taken shamelessly, only from MIT News, but of course it's not only MIT advancing in this sector. This has applications of things like designing and producing better medicines on many of our minds today during the continuing pandemic, across the natural sciences of great interest to me, colleagues of mine using some of these techniques in cutting-edge particle physics or cosmology or neuroscience, and even increasingly across the humanities and social sciences. So these tools are being put to work already in a really wide range of exciting applications that we will all, or at least many, many of us, I think, come to benefit from. However, it's not only a rosy picture, and again, I think this is on many of our minds these days. And what's been especially concerning to me and to growing numbers of my colleagues and students here on campus are a special kind of challenge that comes up when these very powerful computational tools kind of get embedded or enrolled in the real world. And so there's certain kinds of challenges that come up, both for individuals and indeed for groups, when these techniques leave pristine laboratory settings and are deployed in all kinds of real-world situations. Here are a couple on my mind. I'm sure we can all come up with additional ones. So these challenges are often labeled under a catch-all term, algorithmic bias. And that's a helpful term, but I think it's actually, I've come to think of it as a rather limited term. I think the term primes us to be concerned about things that could be going wrong. That's a helpful function of the term. But I think it also kind of occludes or obscures the range of things that I think we want to be very careful and attentive to. Here, I know it's a little bit hard to read, but here's a plot from a recent, very brief, very accessible paper that two of my colleagues here at MIT published just over the summer. It's available for free, and I'll say more about the venue in which we shared this material in a few minutes. This is written by Harini Suresh. Harini is a very advanced PhD student here in computer science, and she was working closely with her main advisor, John Guttag, who's a very senior, very eminent computer scientist. And this is a kind of primer. No prerequisites. It's not written only for experts at computing. Even I could understand it. That's a good test. And they're really just walking through the various stages of things that can go wrong or can at least lead to unintended and potentially harmful consequences throughout the entire machine learning pipeline. So whereas the single term algorithmic bias might prime us to think about this, work like this by Harini and John, and of course by many colleagues elsewhere, has really helped us zero in on distinct types of things to be careful about that might call for distinct areas of focus and possible mitigation. So for example, instead of talking only about kind of bad data, let's talk about how the data is collected, sampled, filtered, processed. Those are often separate steps. Let's talk about how the model is designed, calibrated, evaluated, and deployed. Again, often separate steps where different kinds of things could go wrong in each one. And again, I'll come back to Harini and John's discussion in a few minutes. And so today, I want to talk briefly about two examples of this that, again, are on my mind a lot. I think we could all come up with additional ones. But I think they exemplify the kinds of challenges we want to be especially sensitive to when these remarkably powerful and modern techniques leave laboratory settings and really start to impact lots of people in many parts of the world. So one of these is facial recognition technologies. I have a number of friends and colleagues here who are experts on this. I think it's amazing the advances that have been made in this area of research. There was a semi-recent study conducted by the US National Institute of Science and Technology, or NIST, formerly known as the National Bureau of Standards. And they did this really quite extensive report and evaluation on nearly 200 separate facial recognition algorithms, most of which were already commercially available. They've been produced by nearly 100 different makers or companies. And they assessed these algorithms on two different kinds of tests. There's what they call the one-to-one matching, which is kind of like when you unlock your phone because it knows the target it's searching for. And there's also one-to-n matching, which comes up for example, things like large databases of mugshots if you're looking for a potential in say, a criminal situation. So they performed these tests of both of these kinds of tests on nearly 200 distinct algorithms. Very extensive study, easy to find for free on the web. You can find it easily. The examples of the results look like this. I know it's hard to read all that. The upshot is each of those blue pins, blue or red pins, is a specific algorithm in their set, nearly 200 distinct algorithms. And this is one example of the test they ran. This is measuring the so-called false positive rates, a claimed match that turned out not to be a correct match in the 1-to-n exercise. The blue diagonal line suggests comparable rates of false positive errors when applied to faces of men from Western Africa or when applied to faces of men from Eastern Europe. And I think you can see they're clustering very far from that blue diagonal line. In fact, they're overwhelmingly clustering with much higher, much elevated false positive rates when deployed on faces of men from Western Africa. Not 20% higher or 50% higher. Most of them are more than 10 times higher error rates than the comparable application to faces of men from Eastern Europe. And some of them are worse than 100 times high elevated error rates. These are extraordinary mismatches in these commercially available algorithms that were already out there, many of which are already out there in the world. The NIST study goes through tests like this on a whole battery of tests. So to boil it down, the false positive rates for people from, in particular, West Africa and East Asia, compared to faces of people from Eastern Europe, was often a 10 to 100 times effect on the false positive rate. Likewise, doing the same exercise on catalogs of faces of women versus men, found categorically higher error rates, false positive rates, when applied to women than men across all areas of the world. Now, my colleagues in computing are well aware of this, and there's an enormous amount of research going on to identify and mitigate these kinds of errors, these biases. Here's one example of a review article from roughly a year ago that already was surveying the latest activity in this very active area. So there's lots and lots of research going on. This is an identified challenge in the research community. The problem is, of course, these tools are no longer only in the laboratory. They're already deployed and in active use across many parts of the United States and other parts of the world. And that's an example of one of these special challenges, which is now having real harms on real people and real communities. So to stick with this example of facial recognition and the false positive rate, in the United States alone, we have thousands of distinct law enforcement jurisdictions, each of which is basically allowed to make its own decisions for things like purchasing facial recognition technologies or not, or other forms of technology. These are already being deployed in many of these jurisdictions, and they're subject to no overarching regulation, standardization, or oversight. That has led to a series of often highly publicized cases of wrongful arrest of several black men in the cases that I've been reading about. And this is a combination of failures. It comes from the sort of calibration errors of the sort that the laboratory scholars have already been working hard to identify and mitigate, but it's not only that the tool is somehow run amok. They're being used by real people in real, often very messy real-world situations. and that leads to the failures to even deploy the tools with the kinds of checks or appropriate procedures that might have been recommended. And that's to be expected. That's true for any kind of new tool when it escapes a kind of pristine, highly controlled laboratory environment. And so there's a combination of user errors and tool weaknesses, and these are really exacerbating some pretty significant challenges. So not only is this a problem for when the tool is deployed, these tools are being put into existing systems of a larger criminal justice system, which again, as we know, is certainly far from perfect even before these tools were introduced. And so work by some of the scholars whose books I show here and many others have really helped me realize that the tools are being used in existing systems. And that, again, has the possibility, and now beyond possibility, is leading to some really significant harms. So, for example, if you have a highly, highly elevated false positive rate for members of certain communities who are already having highly elevated encounters with the police, more likely to have police activity in some communities than others, then the high false positive rate in the laboratory setting is only going to exacerbate potential false positives and indeed false arrests or wrongful arrests. Likewise, it's not only the point of interacting with police. There's things like minimum sentencing guidelines in many jurisdictions. So someone who has prior convictions on unrelated charges, perhaps from a decade ago, could be facing really, really exorbitant consequences if a wrongful arrest goes to trial. So you have pressures on some people to plead guilty to things that they had nothing to do with because they were picked up by the wrongful application of imperfect tools and then brought into a system that already is not treating everyone fairly. So we have more than just a kind of computational calibration error. We have a systematic problem that's being exacerbated when these very clever and very promising tools are being deployed imperfectly in real-world settings. I find, now, it doesn't have to be that way, and I've been going back with my historian's cap on to think about other forms of new once new forensic technologies that are now deployed in all kinds of consequential real-world settings. And I think about, for example, fingerprinting. We know fingerprinting is far from perfect even today. Nonetheless, it is subject to continuing expert review, very specific requirements for training and standardization. It's not perfect, but it's being worked on in the recognition that it has real consequences in the world. We're nowhere near that, at least so far, with things like facial recognition technologies. Okay, the problem is not going to go away. It's going to get worse. We're approaching the point where there are almost one surveillance camera per living human on the planet. We're closing in on that gap, which is not something, I think, to celebrate. Already just in the United States alone, half of the adult US population has facial images that are already accessible to databases available to law enforcement. This is not only collections of mugshots of people arrested, let alone convicted. This is half the adult population. The problem is, of course, not limited only to the United States. Let me talk quickly about a second example, then I'll come to what my colleagues and I are excited to do in this space. The second example deals with what's called natural language processing, another just absolutely fascinating area where a lot of my colleagues here at MIT have really been pioneers and really advancing this amazing technology. That's what helps things like Siri and Alexa and things that many of us interact with now on a regular basis. So far, one of the largest and most used data sets for natural language processing is what's called a corpora, a collection of emails, that came from employees of Enron, which is a name that might be familiar to many of you. It was the large Texas-based energy conglomerate that declared bankruptcy almost exactly 20 years ago, December of 2001. So ultimately, more than 20 executives from that company either pleaded guilty or were convicted on multiple felony fraud charges. A few years after the first wave of these lawsuits and criminal charges, the US Federal Energy Regulatory Commission released 1.6 million emails that had been sent to or from a collection of senior executives at this company within, you can see, a limited time window. After fairly minimal processing of this enormous amount of text, the emails were simply made publicly available on a website. Employees were given a very brief limited opt-out, so the default was to opt in. You had to know to then go in and try to opt out. And otherwise, these emails were simply made publicly accessible. Now, to me, that sounds unbelievable, but just to remind myself and remind all of you, when that was done, Mark Zuckerberg hadn't even dropped out of college yet. We were not yet living in an immersive world of social media where some of us might have thought twice or three times before putting 1.6 million seemingly private emails onto a website. What's happened in the 18 years since that corpora has become publicly available? There are more than 20,000 academic research studies that have been published on the basis of that very rich data set. So as you can tell, more than 1,000 published studies per year. Now, although no accusations, let alone legal actions, were ever brought against the vast majority of people who are either at the company or whose emails were swept up in this public release, researchers are still, as of a year or two ago, finding tens of thousands of examples of sensitive, personally identifiable information within this publicly accessible data set, this corpus, including things like Social Security numbers and other highly sensitive things we don't want to just give out to any old person who can find it, as well as examples of embarrassing episodes, extramarital affairs, binging, drink fests, and all the rest, things you might not want to have shared on behalf by the federal government. So beyond the privacy concerns, what I find most compelling, or most shocking actually, is what this is doing as a basic training data set for now many, many, many advances in natural language processing. And this quotation in the middle here comes from a piece I've really learned a lot from by the legal scholar Amanda Lewandowski. So I'm going to quote Amanda here. She says, if you think there might be significant biases embedded in emails sent among employees of a Texas oil and gas company that collapsed under federal investigation for fraud stemming from systemic, institutional, unethical culture, you would be right. You passed the quiz. The Enron emails are simply not representative, not geographically, not socioeconomically, not even in terms of race or gender. Indeed, researchers have used this data set specifically to analyze gender bias and power dynamics encoded or embedding in the natural language among the senders and recipients. And yet this data set remains the go-to data set for training AI systems in natural language processing. And as Professor Lewandowski goes on to say, this is at least in part because they're available and they're for free and they're not copywritten. So whereas other possibly more representative or appropriate examples of human speech or human natural language use in principle could be used to train these data sets, they're often locked up behind copyright and so on. So this is easy to access, even though everyone knows it is clearly not representative or maybe even appropriate. Okay, so I want to come back to this, I think, really helpful, accessible short piece that Harini and John wrote and published with us just over the summer. It's called Understanding Potential Sources of Harm Throughout the Machine Learning Life Cycle. Here again, you see their illustration, a little text on the side. No need to try to read all that on your own. It's available for free at a place I'll show you in a moment. The point is, as colleagues like Harini and John and many, many colleagues and students across MIT and many other research settings have been showing, these kinds of challenges show up all over the place at many distinct points along designing, calibrating, and deploying these kinds of tools, and they're already out in the world. Not only the examples I mentioned, but in policing, in setting recommendations for bail, and even for sentencing within the criminal justice system, in healthcare, in approving or evaluating loan applications for real estate and personal finance, for screening for hiring applications. These are out there. We know they're far from perfect. We know the problems can be exacerbated when they're used in the real world, and they're already out there. So what are we doing? So let me pivot and tell you a little bit about what we're doing here at MIT on the social and ethical responsibilities of computing. I won't go through this entire map. This is just a picture of some of the overlapping areas that my colleagues and I have been working on within research, teaching, and broader engagements. Working on this, I have an absolutely terrific colleague, Professor Julie Shaw. Julie and I together are the two associate deans for CERC. Julie is what we call at MIT a lifer. She was an undergraduate student at MIT, did her PhD at MIT, and then very soon after that joined the faculty. She's an expert in autonomous systems and robotics. She's a professor in aeronautics and astronautics, and I work with her. I work in the history science and in physics. And together for the past 2 years, we've been heading up these new efforts in CERC. Thank goodness we're not alone. Julie has enormous stores of energy, but we also can rely on many, many friends and partners. Just in the past 2 years, we've been very lucky to work with more than 70 MIT faculty and senior researchers. More than 50 undergraduates. Our students are very engaged and excited to work in this area. 35 graduate students, 7 postdocs. It's really an amazing team, and it's growing every term. These folks aren't just coming to a lunch and hearing a talk. They're working with us for at least a whole semester, often in much smaller teams and groups, always explicitly multidisciplinary. So we've been putting together these groups, drawing on all 5 schools at MIT, School of Engineering, School of Science, School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences, the Sloan School of Management, as well as the School of Architecture and Planning. We need all these forms of expertise and experience, and thankfully we've been able to draw upon them for whole semester-long projects. So let me give you a few quick examples on the teaching side. Our aim is to make an engagement with SERC, with social and ethical responsibilities of computing, literally inescapable for our students. And that means not just offering one new, perhaps very high-quality course on kind of ethics that you take over on the side, but rather embedding this material in the readings, in the problem sets, in the lectures and the modules, in some of our most influential large introductory computing classes, as well as in more specialized courses in business, in the political science department, in economics, in media studies, certainly throughout computer science and beyond. We do this with these multidisciplinary teams. It's frankly been a lot of fun and very exciting to build these new materials. One thing we've done is launch this new peer-reviewed case studies series, and I encourage you to all check them out. You can see the URL there on the bottom. Entirely open access. You should be able to get them from any linked device in the world. These are brief cases. These are not like typical business school or law school cases, which are really meant to be exhaustive and encyclopedic. These are brief, 4,000 words. It's like a kind of Scientific American article length. They're based on original research by topical experts, and we review them here by senior scholars and undergraduate volunteers. They're aimed principally for use in undergraduate instruction, but we also hope they're of broader interest and value well beyond that. They are reviewed, as I say, by a multidisciplinary team. Each case study is reviewed by equal proportions of experts in computing and the data sciences and in humanities, arts, and social sciences. They're also reviewed by some really fantastic MIT undergraduates who are often much more critical than my professor colleagues. They can really tell us what's boring or irrelevant or should be trimmed back. The cases themselves are written by experts wherever they may be. The authors need to have no particular connection to MIT. We review them, we try to improve them here at MIT, we share them with the world. And so the example that I flashed up a few times by now by Harini Suresh and John Guttag was published in this new series. Here's the first issue, which we published not quite a year ago, winter of 2021. We published twice a year. We had our follow-up issue in the summer. I'm now working very hard on issue 3. So far, the authorship has come from experts in computer science, many leading computer scientists, legal studies, urban studies, literature, anthropology, political science, media studies, history. The list is growing. Philosophy is in the hopper for next. So the idea is that none of us has the answer to these challenges. We better get better at learning from each other. Together with our colleagues, we've been working on fine-tuning in-class teaching materials in addition to these readings, homework assignments, in-class demos, active learning projects. We're also going to make all of those available entirely for free on MIT's really quite wonderful OpenCourseWare site in hopes that there will be a value at other institutions, high schools, self-driven learners, and so on. That's in the works and will be up hopefully in a few weeks. Let me talk briefly about some examples in research. So our goal here is to really, again, work with these multidisciplinary teams to develop tools and guidance that can help us each get better at designing and deploying these very powerful, often very valuable, but imperfect tools, keeping in mind that many of them are going to leave laboratory settings before too long. And again, the focus is on what can we learn from and with each other, these multidisciplinary teams. So one of the things we've started doing is to be informed by century-long practices in other areas of engineering, so-called safety engineering, much as we heard about even with the previous speaker. The airline industry and civil transportation more generally has had a very, very rich and I think quite successful history in learning from when things go poorly. If there's a train derailment, there are formal procedures to try to identify what combination of things didn't go as planned, and then to build that into the training of new engineers and the regulation of systems. What would it take to do after incident reports on harms or unintended consequences within the computing and data sciences? And so as I say, we're used to doing this when trains don't behave as we expect. We have things in the US like the National Transportation Safety Board. What can we do in computing? So we put together a team to try to kind of beta test that. Again, a multi-discipline team, experts in computer science, robotics, automation, law and public policy, urban studies and planning, architecture, formally trained ethicists, history of technology, and so on. And we're working on our first study. We want to say not just could someone do this, let's do it. Let's roll up our sleeves and draft something that we hope we could all begin to learn from, not to sort of wag fingers and say, you messed up, but rather say what systematic things didn't go as planned, how do we gather that knowledge more proactively and learn from the past. And again, our plan is to make all these materials available for free, open access. That's sort of learning from the past, looking prospectively, looking now more actively toward the future, working with a number of really remarkable colleagues. We're working on this thing we call the Ethical Computing Platform, which again is in production. We hope to share it very soon. It's going to be an entirely free online interactive website platform that research groups can use iteratively, not just once at the start of a new research project, but at multiple stages before, during, and after planning a new project. And it walks through, basically, it's kind of structured brainstorming. Have you thought about very specific things? And it helps break it down both in topics and across a kind of timeline. If you do this, will that lead to this branching set of decisions in the future? And it's really just helping to bring to the fore, bring to the surface explicit consideration of the benefits, but also the burdens of the things that we build and we're so eager to share. So I've been working on this with, principally from the faces shown here. Abby Jakes did her PhD at MIT in philosophy. She's a formally trained ethicist, an applied ethicist. Milo Phillips Brown also did his PhD in philosophy here. He was our inaugural CERC postdoc, and unfortunately, he's so good, we lost him early. The best reason you lose a postdoc, he's now a professor at Oxford, both in philosophy and in computer science, and thanks to Zoom, we can still work very, very smoothly together. Aude Oliva is here in the MIT Schwarzman College of Computing. She's an expert herself in natural language processing and really helping to build out all kinds of new capacities in the college. Ben Armstrong is a PhD in political science and now leads our Industrial Performance Center, and then Julie and myself. You can see we have wireframes. Don't look too carefully. That's a stand-in text. But we're working hard to build this new website based on the research that especially Abby and Milo have been refining now for several years. We're actively beta testing this. If you're interested, if this could be of possible value for your own group, please get in touch with me. We're working not only with academic researchers and students, we also have an informal partnership with Cambridge City Government, which I'm very excited about. What about the kind of civic or nonprofit sector? We're working with robotics professional organizations. Before they submit a paper for a conference, they have to show they've gone through some of this exercise, and with a growing list of industrial partners to try to say, how can this be effective for different kinds of needs or uses? Let's make this as helpful as it can be. So let me wrap up. Computing and the data sciences, not only are they not going away, they're fantastic. They've already yielded fantastic progress and benefits for society, well beyond kind of closed-off laboratory applications. But as we know, they're also already in the world and not always causing good outcomes. Like any new technology, like radio and like fax machines, like many things we can go and learn from in the past, they carry risks. They carry risks of unintended consequences and real harms to individuals and to groups. And as I say, these challenges often come from this very messy kind of human mix of smart, well-intentioned tools that are imperfect because they'll always be imperfect, being deployed in far from ideal, real-world, messy situations. So how do we make progress? This calls on input and expertise from across the fields of academic study. At MIT, we've been very lucky to get buy-in from a growing fraction of the entire faculty, as well as very enthusiastic students. And it can't only be academics either. That's why I'm especially glad to meet with this group. We're looking to actively partner and learn from the private sector, from nonprofits, from NGOs, from the people who are impacted by these tools, and not only those who implement them and design them. Our goal is to make all these tools freely available on sites like MIT OpenCourseWare or our case study site, which I hope you'll check out. Because we don't have all the answers either, we hope others will adopt and also adapt and improve these things. And if we can put our best efforts out there for free, hopefully others can work with us. It means building new connections among researchers and students here at MIT and indeed beyond. Thank you very much. So I see the first question here, do you have ideas about how we can make algorithms more transparent to consumers or government agencies? Is there a way to make them more open to the people who didn't create them? It's a great question, and the short answer is I don't know. What I know is the people I'd go ask that question to. So I'm going to punt by saying that's a question that I share the urgency behind the question. It got a lot of upvotes, and I would upvote that one too. I think that's enormously important. I'm not an expert in these fancy algorithms. I'm merely a quantum physicist. What do I know about these things? And an historian. But what I now know, and what I really value from having taken on this role, is I now know dozens, not one or two, but dozens of extremely dedicated, smart colleagues at MIT, including very, very dedicated students, who are very thoughtful and more knowledgeable about this than I am. So I know the team I put together to learn more about this, including, for example, my close colleague Julie Shaw and her research group. So that's one example of trying to put these tools out there because I don't have the answers. Together we might help get closer to some good answers. There's another question here. What are recommendations to avoid identity theft in light of massive data leakage issues? A great question. I don't have a recommendation, but I'll tell you, I mentioned briefly we're doing this first kind of trial test of an after-incident report. Let me just tell you briefly what the cases we've identified that we're digging into involve. So if you have trouble sleeping tonight, you can blame me. I no longer sleep well at night over this. This involves the unintentional re-identification, the identification of sensitive healthcare-related, personally identifiable information from the combination of multiple data sets, each of which had been formally de-identified. Each data set on its own should have not revealed inappropriate, sensitive personal information, in this case about healthcare. And yet, it takes well-trained computer scientists not very long at all to basically concatenate some of these publicly accessible, easily downloadable data sets and start re-identifying real individuals, not just it's a 98% chance it's someone in Cambridge, Massachusetts, but say it's Dave Kaiser. That scares the heck out of me, and that's been going on now for a long, long time. I don't have good answers, but that's the kind of thing we chose to focus on for our first after-incident report, precisely because it is going to impact more and more of us as time goes forward. Looks like I'm out of time. Thank you so much, and please don't hesitate to get in touch.